Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started now. My name is Carolyn Doyle, and I'm on the organizing committee for Words, and it's a real privilege for me to be able to host this session this afternoon. I would like to welcome you to the 2018 James Memorial Lecture, which is provided today in partnership with Words and London Public Library. Now in its 8th year, the Memorial Lecture Series celebrates the legacy of Canadian poet and playwright James Crerar, James Reaney, with a talk by a distinguished speaker who is knowledgeable about the life and work of Reaney, as well as the literary and cultural history of Southwestern Ontario. Previous speakers have included Jamie's poetic and incredible wife and partner, Colleen Thibodeau, Jean Mackay, John Beckwith, David Ferry, Tom Gary, and Peter Denny. And I want to give a plug right now because Peter Denny will be with us tomorrow and performing with Murray Favreau and Bill Bissett at 6 p.m. up in the center space here to do a reading and a small performance on behalf of the Luddites. So welcome you to all come back for that. The Memorial Lecture Series is one way that the Reaney family, Susan and James Reaney, celebrate the legacy of their parents. But I would also encourage you to check out the website that Susan helms, ColleenThibodeau.com and JamesReaney.com, respectively, where there's a wealth of interesting information about these two incredible people. Words Festival is thrilled to have the opportunity to present this year's Memorial Lecture, which features the very knowledgeable James Stewart Reaney. James' talk today is, I was so much older then. Are you younger than that now?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm waiting to hear how the rest of it plays out in the talk. A reconsideration of James Reaney's plays for children starring Apple Butter, Hilda History, Amelia, Baby One, Tecumseh, and more. So as many of you know, James was also, he was an incredible playwright, but was also well known for his creative creation and use of puppets. And James Reaney and Susan Reaney and James Stewart Reaney appreciate the generous support of donors and the hard work and expertise of Museum London and the Canadian Museum of History staff in making possible the temporary exhibitions starring Moo Cow and Tree Wuzzle, two of the marionettes from James Reaney's play Apple Butter. And these are on display right now in the center gallery. Also, up in the center gallery, you will also find copies of James' book published by Brick Books, So West to Home. But first, a little bit about James. Born in Winnipeg in 1952, James moved to London in 1960 when his parents, writers Colleen Thibodeau and Jamie Reaney, decided to return to their London region roots. James has been a witness to and participated in London's creative community since the 1960s. In 1977, he wrote a book about his father's plays for the Profiles and Canadian Drama series. In more than 30 years as a journalist at the London Free Press, James Stewart Reaney has covered everything from operas to Neil Young concerts to baseball World Series, unfortunately not the Orioles. He produced the first extensive top 10 devoted to London albums and named a London Music Scene Personality of the Year as part of a year-end recognition of local excellence. James has always been critical at building community and celebrating the musicians and artists of our community. In collaboration with colleagues, he hosted weekly videos devoted to London performers and creators for 8 years before retiring in early 2017. And in retirement, James continues to champion the London scene on multiple platforms. He's a passionate supporter of the Forest City London Music Awards as a board member and advocate for the London Music Hall of Fame. He's also an active member of the London Middlesex Historical Society and helmed 3 editions of the Great London Songbook. In addition, James is a contributor to London Fuse. He's no slouch in retirement. Please join me today in welcoming James Stewart Reaney.
Well, this will be does this sound good? Anyway, thank you, Carolyn, for those kind words, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to screw around with these glasses. I'm in the middle of a operation which they said you didn't have a cataract, you had a cataract. So this eye, you look wonderfully blurry, and this eye, you look great. But eventually they're going to, so if I do fiddle around with the glasses, that's why. I'm grateful to the London Public Library and to WordsFest for giving their series a home after a wonderful start at Stratford with the Stratford Public Library. And Carolyn, I have to acknowledge that you really were critical, and thank you for your leadership in bringing the series to London, to the London Public Library, and to WordsFest. The topic for today is James Reaney's children's plays. There are 4 of them that I'm going to talk about today. Apple Butter, and let me see if I can get this amazing stuff to work. We'll see there. That's Apple Butter and Other Marionettes, and at the right is Alan Stratton, who is known from WordsFest, but certainly a great Canadian author and contributor, and he was in some of these plays. He was a puppeteer and that kind of thing. Names and Nicknames, and it came first in the series in a collaboration with John Hirsch. Geography Match, which premiered here in London via Broughdale Public School Kids, and Ignoramus, which had its premiere performance we're discovering here in 1966, although the official premiere seems to have been at the Toronto Collegiate in 1967. All are from the 1960s, 4 years in that decade from 1963 to 1967. Today's words are dedicated to the memory of our parents. I'm thinking of my sister Susan, who's in the audience here. Susan, terrific, welcome. And London writers Colleen Thibodeau and James Crerar, Jamie Reaney, and to our brother, John Andrew Reaney, who died in 1966. As I begin, also a thank you to my wife, Susan Wallace, and my sister, Susan Reaney, for their tremendous help in preparing this talk. You are free to consider the insights that follow as the 3rd best James Reaney Memorial Lecture. This is based on my sense that the first lecture, delivered by my mother, Colleen Thibodeau, will always be the best, and all the others until now, and after this one, will be tied for 2nd place. So for a 3rd place perspective on 4 plays, I can offer a few insights you will not hear, in some cases, actual audio, anywhere else, and some reflections on plays I first encountered as a preteen or a young teenager in the 1960s, and then wrote a book about in the 1970s. In more recent times, I've occasionally reconsidered the plays and my earlier reactions to them. It's my belief that my 2018 revelations are much less profound than they used to be, and I hope a lot more fun. Before sharing the first such insight, some background. I knew it was a hectic creative time at 276 Huron Street when I was 10 and up in those years. Preparing for this lecture has reminded me, however, how much even an actual witness to history can miss or forget. In addition to the 4 children's plays and the demands of their individual productions, there were other projects, many other projects. In 1963, Dad wrote The Dance of Death in London, Ontario, in collaboration with London artist Jack Chambers. Throughout the 1960s, he edited Alphabet, a magazine he not only edited, but at least in the early years of the decade, set the type for. He wrote 12 Letters to a Small Town, a tribute to his hometown Stratford, in collaboration with John Beckwith, whose name we've heard already as a presenter here of a memorial lecture, the Canadian musician, former dean of the University of Toronto's Music School. 12 Letters was awarded Dad's 3rd Governor General's Medal. In 1965, there was more musical collaboration, including the libretto for Chivalry, an opera with music by John Beckwith. The Sun and the Moon, a play which premiered in summer theater here. Then Dad's children's novel, The Boy with an R in His Hand, which this past summer was adapted just marvelously for the stage at Fanshawe Pioneer Village by Adam Corrigan Hollowitz. I don't know if Adam's here, but that was a tremendous, tremendous production. And can you believe it? There was also a production of Dad's first play, The Killdeer, in Glasgow, directed by the late David Williams and with the late Bernard Hopkins in the cast. Dad flew to Glasgow to see his play performed there, and then, joy of joys, he brought me back 2 records I'm sure he had no clue what he was bringing back. He just got the Glasgow hipsters to go find out what the hippest records were. The Who's Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere, and Manfred Mann's If You Gotta Go, Go Now. I still play those cherished 45s and think of Dad finding them with the help of the Glasgow hipsters for me. Back to Dad's busy decade. In 1966, Listen to the Wind premiered as part of an all-Canadian season of summer theatre in London 1 year before the centennial celebrations. And that was quite a daring move. Centennial year, people were all about Canada. The year before, frankly, not so much. Also in the creative mix was another collaboration with the name we've mentioned already, the Winnipeg and Stratford theatre director, John Hirsch. Colors in the Dark premiered at Stratford in 1967. It shares some of the words with the 4 children's plays I'm discussing. Martha Henry and Heath Lamberts were in the cast of Colors, also in the original cast of Names and Nicknames. And I handed out Flowers, which we think as Black-Eyed Susans at the premiere at the Avon Theatre, and wore with pride my Sgt. Pepper red military jacket, which I'd recently bought in Stratford. I'll share it. It wouldn't surprise anyone, I hope, but the insight here is that I was looking at a list Alvin Lee had compiled of some of the things my father was doing in those years. And of course, the name I wish to pay tribute to is Colleen Thibodeau, his soulmate, because frankly, without my mother, whose name doesn't appear necessarily in the credits and some of the dedications for sure, but she was a great creative spirit in her own, but was also the leader on the home front and in many, many other ways. So I think you don't see her name necessarily in some of the lists, but it's there for me and I think for all of us. In those creative years, one personal eyewitness memory does stand out. That unique insight relates to my performance as the Mayor of the Munchkins in our grade 8 classes, Wizard of Oz, circa 1965. That magic moment is in fact a direct influence on at least 2 of the plays I'll be talking about this afternoon. My father came away from the Wizard of Oz perhaps overrating the performance of the young Munchkin Mayor. And he also shared, and I think he has this in common with many parents who go to school shows, a rueful and amused sense that his favorite child in Oz had been on stage for but a few minutes, and that the parents of the 4 main characters, obviously Dorothy, the Cowardly Lion, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow, had more to be pleased about than he did. I recall his telling me that he wanted to develop plays in which everyone in the class would be equally involved as much as possible, more than they were in what was apparently, and I go by my memory here, it was a very good Wizard of Oz. And this is a scene, in a way, Names and Nicknames, the Winnipeg play anticipates this. You can see a chorus of young children involved. So he was already thinking that way, but I think the experience of, and I was a pretty good mayor of the Munchkins, but that feeling of some dissatisfaction made him want to do something about that. 2 of the later plays, Geography Match and Ignoramus, are clearly products of the post-Oz approach. The Mayor of the Munchkins factor may not, however, be as important as I make it. Many of the child actors in Dad's plays are like players in the works for children's orchestra written by Carl Orff. In Orff, not Oz, the interplay of simple elements achieves a final complexity that the children would not have accomplished without full cooperation with each other and the director. A similar procedure is followed in these plays for children. A certain world has been created for these child actors, illuminated by continual games, chants, improvisational catalogs, and useful character types. Another unique insight I can offer is that apple butter was important to my father very late in his life. We were at dinner with him at Marion Villa, where he spent his last years, when it became apparent that, at least on that occasion, verbal communication was not going to happen. Instead, for some reason, I asked Dad to give his apple butter face, and he responded instantly with something like this. My apologies to those in the back. My mimicry doesn't do justice. You did have to be there at the table at Marion Villa. But it was just this playful face he conjured up instantly based on the marionette he'd created 40 years earlier. And the success of the apple butter face motif was followed by 2 other requests, one for Northrop Frye, a mentor and even a father figure to Dad, and the other for Nathan Cohen, a Toronto drama critic who had ridiculed Dad's early plays with really memorable vitriol. The Northrop Frye face was something like this. noble and firm of jaw, a prophet in the glory of his times. When it came to Cohen, Dad twisted his face into a vicious scowl with comically crunched eyebrows. At this point, I'm going to ask for your help. As we go along, you're going to hear the names Rawbone and Treewuzzle fairly often. Now, they were characters in Apple Butter, spirits of nature. It was a shock to me to read the, I thought, fairly simple story of Apple Butter, but most of the play is Apple Butter warding off the efforts of the adults around him to beat him, first with objects of wood. Treewuzzle helps him with that because when he says, if you shout wuzzle, they'll be the ones who get beaten instead. The wily adults then decide to go down and get whalebone hairbrushes. Then the spirit Rawbone, the spirit of all things bony, shows up, and by shouting Rawbone, Apple Butter is able to ward these off. So to keep those evil spirits at bay, I'd ask you first to say wuzzle with me. 1, 2, 3, wuzzle. 1, 2, 3, Rawbone. 1, 2, 3, Rawbone. You will hear those names a number of times, and in the spirit of pantomime everywhere, I'd ask you to call out as you can. When I say Treewuzzle, you say? Wuzzle. When I say Rawbone? Rawbone. Beautiful. I feel safer already. The other thing I have to say is in rereading Apple Butter, I also discovered he really is a smart aleck. There are times you want to give him a little tap yourself, but that's the spirit of being, sort of a Johnny Appleseed figure, I guess. Geography Match expands the mythic framework into a personal vision of Canada. Two groups of children grow as they race across Canada in sort of the 1967 version of The Amazing Race. The strength of family and community is the foundation of names and nicknames, a play shaped by word lists from a school speller. Children grow up and prove strong enough to help defeat the evil nicknamer in their midst. Ignoramus uses its words lists to satirize theories of education. The children grow from infants to teens and mature as much as their educational masters allow. And this is a scene from Apple Butter with Solomon Spoilrod, Hester Pinch, and Victor Nipchopper, the adults who are out to whop Apple Butter. And I think it must be taken at the Western Fair, I think. We'll see some other ones as well. The proscenium is by Jack Chambers, London artist. And the set is the really beautiful set, which eventually molded away and dissolved in my parents' garage, is by Jimmy Anderson, who was the Perth County activist, archivist, artist, and also a cousin of my father's. The marionettes were devised by Dad and the late Jay Peterson, whose daughter Leith may be with us today. Leith, welcome and thank you. The story sets an orphan child alone versus a sinister hired man and brings mythical natural forces to its affectionate presentation of life in Perth County in the 1890s, when James Nesbitt Reaney, my father's father, was a young boy. Quite in keeping with the author's insistence on simplicity is the rough-hewn appearance of the marionettes. They are all primitively formed creatures, mostly of wood, bone, and string, and not particularly human. Leith wrote the following about her mother's involvement in Apple Butter. She looked to an article by my father called Stories on a String, in which he remembered Jay Peterson was a cultural pillar of this town, and she persuaded the Fair Board to commission a marionette show for me. They gave me some money. Pause. Western Fair gives money to untried marionette troupe, untried London creators, actual money. The Western Fair is not short of money, but I don't think it always flows to the marionette people in our community. 1/3 of which went towards a tent. Let me repeat for emphasis. 1/3 of which went towards a tent. So here we have the Western Fair, no shortage of tents at the Western Fair, somehow charging, or somehow the artists end up paying for the tent at the Western Fair with 1/3 of what they got from the Western Fair in the first place. This is a familiar London creative motif, I think. Or is the word trope? I think that's it. But the rest I salvaged to pay artists and manipulators for designs, puppets, theater facades, as well as hours of grueling work, rehearsing, learning, and finally for 10 days in mid-September, performing from, again, repeat this for emphasis, 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. 10 a.m. to 9 p.m., 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. for 10 days in mid-September on the fairgrounds. Most of the manipulators were my graduate students. We still talk about those very happy, very busy days in the fall of 1965. Jamie created apple butter, tree wuzzle, and rawbone. And tree wuzzle is upstairs along with moo cow. My mother made the heads as well as the paper mache hands for the adult characters. This is Leith's words. Mum also designed moo cow, you can see upstairs, an impressive looking bovine with the map of Canada on one side, and you can see that very clearly on the display, built into the Holstein's back and black and white markings. One of the jokes in apple butter is that apple butter asks moo cow, why do you have a map of Perth County on one side of you? And that's the side that would have its back to the wall. And, oh, that's where my mother was born, Perth County. We have a map of Canada on the other side. That's where my father was born, somewhere. He was a roving beast. And whoever was acting moo cow had a great time with that great line. Jamie said that the apple butter production of the Western Fair tent, babies who cried for everything else shut up for moo cow, while backstage visitors inquired after rawbone with a great deal of respect. Apple butter went on to further acclaim in other locations, and that's one of the productions we saw with Alan Stratton first. At one out-of-town production, he enthused that the children practically accompanied apple butter right to the station. So we've got more pictures of apple butter than almost anything else. I still, is that, yeah. Well, and you've seen, these are Solomon Spoilrod and Hester Pinch, and you saw Victor Nipchopper if I just go back for a second, I think you can see him maybe, and you saw him in the colored one as well. He's the hired man. Victor Nipchopper is apple butter's bitter enemy and represents a lighter version of the cuckoo bird usurper villain in The Killdeer, The Easter Egg, and Listen to the Wind. Victor is clumsy and selfish, solely capable of mischief and cruelty, and yet nearly takes Hester Pinch's farm for his own. He bullies and dominates Hester and Solomon Spoilrod and effectively prevents their marriage and reconciliation with apple butter until moo cow blasts him right out of Perth County and the play. I'll offer another unique insight at this point, a bit of family history. My father's stepfather, William Tugwell Cook, was in fact a hired man who came to the farm in the Little Lakes area and ended up marrying the woman I grew up calling Grandma Cook, my father's mother and the divorced wife of James Nesbitt Reaney. William Tugwell Cook and my father had all kinds of complex history going over the decades, but William Cook was responsible for introducing the Donnelly myth, the gory, they deserved to be murdered. They were lower than the worst beasts, but he knew the popular version of the Donnellys and shared that with Dad when Dad was quite young, and which left him fascinated by that story, which after all happened not far off from Perth County. And in fact, if you look at the Donnelly plays, at least one of the other direct connections with William Cook is that there are marvelous scenes where William Donnelly is escaping the police by dressing as a woman, hiding in the haystacks. Those are in fact based on William Cook's efforts to evade conscription around Perth County and relying on many, many friends in the First World War. The quaint romance of the spinster and schoolmaster, Solomon or Hester and Solomon, does bring apple butter to a proper conclusion, like the most comedies. Marriage is an institution that symbolizes stability and fertility in these works. It is the intervention of the nature spirits that makes possible this social harmony. Rawbone? And tree wuzzle? Well, this is great. I worked in those, and you're right up there with the kids, I can tell you. Are sensible guardians for apple butter and even manage to temper his joking. They recall characters in folktales majestic, but still approachable, like Treebeard in The Lord of the Rings. I can tell you in preparing this talk, I was advised it'll be much easier if you use the iPhone little microphone and narrate it. So I went ahead and did that. I found that there are some words iPhone little microphone has no clue. And one of those was tree wuzzle. Very good on Treebeard. Got Treebeard right the first time. At heart, though, is the personality of Apple Butter. Robust and good-natured, he is the human character closest to those two natural champions. In the end, he goes off with Wuzzle and Robone to find his next... Oh, you're better than I am. This is great. Next adventure, and we'll just go here with... And that's... I think you can guess which one is me, I hope. That's my brother John with the hat, and Susan Reaney off to the right. And there, of course, is Apple Butter we've been talking about so much. And that would be probably within the week that Apple Butter had been created. Aside from John Hirsch, its director and visionary, and Ken Winters, who composed the music for the play, the names that jump out of the first cast for names and nicknames are those of 3 members of the first graduating class of the National Theatre School of Canada. Martha Buss, and the name is B-U-H-S. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that terribly, but we all know her as Martha Henry, who was just incredible at Stratford in The Tempest this summer. I hope you got a chance to see that. James Lancaster, better known as Heath Lamberts, and Suzanne Grossman, who was in the first production of The Lion in Winter on Broadway in 1966 and became a theater force in the United States. While they were rehearsing names and nicknames, Martha Henry remembers Jamie sitting there, seemingly asleep, but she came back early from lunch one day to find him alone in the rehearsal hall, and he was tossing this big doll we had up in the air, catching it, swinging it around, and smashing its head into a wall. Those recalls the time that we got the Chipmunks Sing the Beatles hits for Christmas, opened our gifts at about 3 in the morning, played them straight through till noon when Dad broke the record over his... having listened to it as an adult, I can't fault him. I thought maybe I should go, Martha continues, and then I realized he wouldn't care. She says, John was the boss, of course. John and Jamie had known each other for years. John Hirsch had been a student of Dad's in the 50s in Winnipeg at Manitoba. John had this curiosity and passion. He would just throw the play up in the air and look at how it fell. And that's Martha Henry as Mrs. Dell in 1963, and Heath Lamberts consoling her. And you can see the young people in the cast. The group of children form the chorus, and somewhere in those kids are conductor Victor Feldbrill's daughters are somewhere in the cast there. Heath Lamberts told David Ferry, who was the source also of the Martha Henry material I just quoted, there was no improv. We would just do what we thought was appropriate, but if it wasn't appropriate, John Hirsch would tweak. My father recalled John would take the work of the actors and would work it in such detail until they came up with a fantastic image, which we can see really in this beautiful scene, including people who are going to come in, who were great actors and were at the start of their careers, as well as very young children. Names and Nicknames takes place in the pastoral and idyllic community of Broxden, circa 1900. And Broxden is in Perth County, not far from where my father grew up. There is a changeless farm of long ago, Farmer Dell's, and a timeless school setting. The original for the Broxden School was built in 1853 by Scottish settler, and I think I got this right, my great-great-great-grandfather, Peter Crerar. It's now a living museum where groups can learn about the school's routine back in 1910. The schoolmarm, the pretend schoolmarm, now tells a story that says in 1832, Peter Crerar came from Scotland with his family and claimed land in this area to clear and to farm. During his first winter here in Canada, he didn't have a house or a barn or anything to sleep in. So history says he found an overturned tree and he used that hole, perhaps made it bigger, and that's where he spent his first winter. As the story goes, when Crerar's family came and found him in the spring, they told him his winter shelter looked like a Brock's den, Brock being the Irish, Celtic, and Scottish Gaelic word for badger. In an attempt to retain the area's history, when Crerar built the schoolhouse down the road, he called it Brock's Den School. I realize that this story is, in fact, the schoolmarm was repeating for the Stratford Beacon Herald recently, is in fact a story my father related based on family memories in the township histories that his sister, Wilma McKeag, steered. When the children names and nicknames are playing their skipping games or making poems out of their readers, they're also creating beautiful wordplay. However, when they're building a snowman, then making the mean-spirited decision to smash it to bits, They're succumbing to destructive impulses, in short, to nickname or to disfigure. The source of the nicknames is Grandpa Thorntree, a fence viewer and trapper. Thorntree enjoys the pain and confusion of others and is at the height of his power during winter when his traps, one of his favorite lines is, "Rabbit foot, not so lucky," while he's walking around freely on his snowshoes. His vicious attacks on the names chosen for infant children mean there are 51 unchristened babies in the Broxden neighborhood. The children are partly responsible for this. They tease him, and they also find him a useful ally. When they want to attack a schoolmate who maybe hasn't been nice to them, or they're angry, they turn to Grandpa Thorntree for a nasty name. Thorntree's favorite trick is cursing infants just prior to their baptisms with malicious nicknames. The Dells think they've outwitted him after their first child, Amelia, is dubbed Oatmealy before she can be christened. They then decide to try 5 names. So her little brother is Paul, John, Peter, James, Martin. Thorntree thinks about this for a second and spits out too many names. Fat name. So he's Fat Name, and Paul, John, Peter, James, Martin is then called Baby 2 until he can be christened properly. As Baby 2, he later gurgles at Grandpa Thorntree, "Mooly moo, durly early, a doidle." 2 pages later, he proudly joins in the defense of Broxden and shouts names as dissimilar as Norman and Dionysius, the Greek historian. Adult heroes may struggle for 2 acts at least in most plays before rejecting evil so wholeheartedly. In Dad's children's plays, such wild and optimistic spontaneity is part of the game and therefore part of the play. Eventually, a 3rd Dell child is born and christened in spectacular fashion with hundreds of names. The epic list defeats Thorntree, and his transformation into an actual Thorntree is the awful miracle the Dell's friend, the kindly Reverend Hackaberry, has predicted. Celebrations of marriage, children, and fertility triumph over Grandpa Thorntree's evil nature. In the end, he's revealed to be not human. On to Geography Match, and despite several productions in London, I have not found any pictures of Geography Match. We're still looking. It was clearly not the cell phone era. It's hard to imagine any children's play now being put on without several Facebooks and all sorts of other things, but we haven't found them. As Theatre Geography Match develops some of the iconography of Listen to the Wind and Names and Nicknames, there's a stream, light blue cloth standing for a stream reappears, and so does a ladder. In Geography Match, the ladder represents the play's pair of stairs. At the start, there's this scene, a Canadian child fails to climb these stairs, and so the Geography Match children must prove that Canadian kids are strong to satisfy the Governor General who sets up this cross-country contest, and Prince Philip. And that Prince Philip is the Duke of Edinburgh, right? Well, anyway, the Duke of Edinburgh has made this snarky comment about the feebleness of Canadian children. This becomes the challenge to the children in their race across Canada. One of the joys of preparing for this talk was reaching out to members of the original cast at Roughdale School who'd been classmates of my brother, John, and hearing from a number of them, and I didn't connect with everyone I hoped to, but 2 I did connect with, and their memories really touched me, are Kate Colley and Scott Davidson, and they shared their memories of performing in Geography Match. Scott Davidson, a friend of my brother John's, wrote, "I was in Squeak Squeak, character Little Mouse, has a little mouse. Remarkably, no photos were ever taken as I recall. How times have changed. My strongest memory is of the tiny toy mouse I carried on stage as a pet. Barely large enough for spectators in the first row to discern. Important lesson. Stage props need to be larger than life. I fondly remember the world premiere at Middlesex College in May of 1967, followed by a couple of reprises at the Grand Theatre over the Christmas holidays later that year. It was a remarkable achievement your father undertook to celebrate Canada's centennial." And my feeling is that Dad had something like Geography Match in mind, may have been pitching it on some national level. It didn't take off, but then he wanted to connect with John's classmates at Roughdale and took the idea to them. And Kate Colley, she lived on Huron Street, and even in fact on the same block that the Reaneys, Thibodeaus did during the 1960s, wrote, "Mainly I remember that your dad let us be real actors in real theaters with real responsibilities. Mainly, I remember he also encouraged us to improvise and to let our creativity run free. I composed the recorder music I played, but that was minor compared to the music other kids composed and played. He let us create things out of nothing, although it's probably more accurate to say he gently required us to create grown-up things out of nothing. Lunette, and that was her character in Geography Match, was meek and mild, but other characters were grand and fantastical, creatures to be reckoned with. Some part of me is still looking over a shoulder for them in case they're coming. And those included mystic forces, Muskeg, Nana Bijou, Tecumseh, all kinds of figures, Iceberg Lady, amazing characters. Your dad enveloped the whole class with love after John died. The day of the funeral, he had us all around the piano at your place as he made up music and songs and kept us singing and laughing. And I have no I remember some details about the funeral, but I have no remembrance of that marvelous healing moment. That was grade 6. We were in grade 8 in 1967 when he turned the class into a theater company. We rehearsed downtown, and we think the rehearsals were at Alpha Center on Talbot Street. Then when it was time for a stage, we rehearsed in that theater at Western. It was simultaneously serious and a whole lot of fun. I still feel proud of performing at the Grand Theatre. That's something Scott Davidson and other people I talked to. Performing at the Grand Theatre is, and it always will be, but it's a big deal for young people in London. It's the gold standard for our local excellence, I think, if it's one way to say that. I was grade 12, having been in some of those mixed grade classes at Broughdale Public School. I'll just pause here. Broughdale Public School is on Epworth Avenue in London. If you went slightly west from the school, which is now, I think King's University College owns it. If you went slightly west of the school to 241 Epworth Avenue, who would be playing saxophone on the Whoever said that, yes, Garth Hudson from the band grew up on Epworth Avenue. I don't know that he attended Broughdale. He might have attended a school farther out in the county, but he certainly went to Medway. He went to Medway, thank you. Geography Match ends optimistically with the Canadian child able at last to climb that pair of stairs. Then the ball of string spool knitting, which one of the characters has been carrying throughout the whole play, pulls in a member of the audience, suggesting that such exploration and discovery is accessible to anyone choosing to travel across Canada. Speaking of Canada, this is a Words Festival moment that it might not happen this weekend, but we'll get it done eventually. Kate Cawley remembers, and this must have been the production of the Grand, Tony Urquhart, who was then in London, great artist, devised a setting for Geography Match, a map of Canada outlined in masking tape on a huge piece of plywood. Can't find a trace of that, and I don't know if Tony Urquhart is around this afternoon, but we would love to find some trace or some other recollections of that. All right, we're going to move on to Ignoramus. Now, this is a little unusual. Okay, this is a little unusual. We have Hilda History here, the Hall Dennis report symbolizing her rival, Professor Progosaurus in the play. She's Hilda History in the play, and her book, So Little for the Mind, which is so little for the spine in the play. And if I can figure out how to do this, I may try to play a little bit of the CBC radio. There, I can see the icon. Let's see. Oh, what happened? Is that bad news? That's bad anyway. But Dad remembers a CBC radio debate in 1954, which I was able to track down with the help of CBC archives, in which he claimed that Hilda History demolished this figure from the Charles Phillips, who was the head of what I think was going to become OISE. We're looking for thank you. And, okay, let's go back to 1954, Saskatchewan CBC Citizens Forum, if this works. Okay. There it goes. Yep. Okay. I'll just continue with we're getting in the technical things here. In the play, 20 little orphans float into the modern world, guided by two bitterly opposed educational theorists who are based on these actual people. Hilda Neatby becomes Hilda History, and Charles Phillips becomes Dr. Charles Progosaurus. They have all kinds of adventures and misadventures. Hilda History teaches her children all the Roman emperors. Charles Progosaurus' pupils have the hardest time figuring out they're on an island because his whole idea is express yourself. You'll realize what it is. So of course when the point is when there's this difficult pupil in his class, a guy called Bruce, who doesn't want to do anything, he'll have a lesson plan which calls for, we'll put a red flag, then we'll walk all the way around and find the red flag so you'll know you're on an island. Of course, Bruce immediately picks up the red flag, puts it in his back pocket, and they keep... It's Pelee Island. Then they end up driving cars around in circles and things like that. Yeah. Anyway, we're back from 1954. We were briefly at Saskatchewan in 1954, but that's the feeling. I mean, she was intense. Hilary Bates Neary played her in the early versions in London, and Alan Stratton, who was later on, was great as all, Mackenzie King, for instance, remembers being Dr. Charles Progosaurus. Amazingly enough, in Progosaurus' Island, there's a student called Beatrice in the class. She develops a religion based on bonhomie, and teaches most of the class, except for Bruce, to read. And they develop a litany, a religion based on this, and the litany is as follows: bonhomie, polishes as it cleans, makes porcelain gleam, no red hands, hasn't scratched yet, and that's in reference to, you can see the little chick, and that was one of the bonhomie selling points, was that it wouldn't scratch your windows, hadn't scratched yet. In the final judgment, the charming musician Cynthia from Hilda History's class compensates for her classmate Stephen's priggishness when the history students are being judged by the Governor General. Beatrice shares her existence poem, which says, "Love and patience do quite change the scene," and that shows up in colors in the dark, balancing the transistor radio enforced isolation of Bruce, shades of today's smartphones. Ignoramus doesn't really end, because Hilda and Charlie are going to switch classes and see what happens next. The idea is there'll be a huge prize awarded to whoever's the better educator. Well, the Governor General wisely decides this, in fact, is a tie. Beatrice is so amazing, she cancels out everything stupid Charles Progosaurus has done. And perhaps if Progosaurus is exposed to Hilda's students, he'll come out of his trendy ignorance. Then comes one final turn. As the curtain falls, Bruce drops to his knees, acknowledging his ignorance and begging Professor History to teach him to read. The real victory's already been won through faith and the imagination of Beatrice. The education of the 18 orphans, one has died in each class. And again, this was something I realized rereading it. It stands for my brother's death, because the pupil who dies in the classes died about the same age my brother would have been. Their education is essentially complete, and their minds are ready to bloom. The 4 children's plays offer us marionettes and myths, Canada and community, family and education. To really enjoy them, however, we should surrender to our imaginative world. Like the 4 friends at the start of Listen to the Wind, let's end this way. We're all children somewhere in Canada thinking about putting on a play. Thank you very much. There we are. Yes, Wuzzle and Rawbone, you can say that again, and there's our last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. That was fascinating. I think we've got time for just maybe 1 or 2 questions.
I got lots of answers, so. I hope for the,
Yes.
It's just a wee anecdote, James.
yeah.
I didn't know that your dad had a Nathan Cohen face.
Oh.
I worked at the Press Theatre years and years, well, in the 60s. And Nathan Cohen would attend the plays, and he would always leave before, in the middle, and he would stomp up the aisle with his cane very loudly, and was notorious for being not a nice person, not a kind person.
I think Dad was more amused than devastated. My only regret is that that's the part of the anecdote I shared with the Globe and Mail when whoever was writing the obituary for Dad, and that's the part that came out as if his life was spent with this Ahab-like pursuit of Nathan Cohen, which wasn't really true. No, thank you, that's amazing.
Anybody else? A couple things go up earlier.
Well, now, I have, oh, go ahead, if there's a question. I've got, can I just, I was looking for someone. I think we had copies of this thanks to the author and editor David Ferry and to Playwrights Canada Press. We were able to give away, I don't know, do we have any left or have we given them all away? Maybe if they're outside. There's still some outside the door. If you don't have one, please, and there's still some left, please take one. I would say we're really honored that we were able to make this. Names and Nicknames is one of the plays in here. But if I can say something in the spirit of Words Fest, you've got one free, now go out and buy one. At least one. Because there are so many great writers and creators represented and so many opportunities to get close to their work.
Marion?
I'm just wondering how you would connect these early plays with the later plays. This is like
How would, was it an apprenticeship? Well, another thing I realized, and again, in retrospect, you see how much recycling Dad was prepared to do, that he would take something, he didn't like transistor radios, so there are two bad kids who have a transistor radio thing. I think with say, the Donnellys, if that's one of the later, the example of later works, they're doing a lot of the things the kids are, they're expected to form those shapes and to recite long lists of place names, so I think they're in smaller, form. Yeah, but I think they'd be in his mind, yes.
That's it. So I would like to wrap up and just say thank you once again, James. That was really not just informative, it was entertaining, it was delightful. It's always so great to get more insight onto your dad, your mom,
Yeah.
your family, and thank you to Susan Reaney as well for all that you've contributed to this, and to Susan Wallace. So it's the Reaney team.
Yeah. Oh yes.
So thank you, and I see lovely Lisa Moore here. So,
Yep. We'll move on.